Good day, students. The topic for the video today is questionnaires and scales, which one to use in research. And the video actually discusses what to consider when you are building or having to decide on a questionnaire for your research project. Let us start off the conversation with defining what is a questionnaire. A questionnaire is a tool. It's usually a list of questions that's used for collecting mostly quantitative data in research surveys. Collection of questions that represent those central concepts in your research project. So it's a number of questions that you have formulated that you want to ask the respondents to your survey. A questionnaire is mostly composed on the basis of your thoughts and your desires in your research project. The questions in a questionnaire are usually self-designed, so you think about them and you ask the questions on your own, from your own perspective. The application of questionnaires, however, is limited to exploratory and descriptive kinds of studies that do use cross-sectional designs but have a very basic purpose for your research. As I say, exploration or description, these kinds of studies can still use self-designed questionnaires. The problem with questionnaires is that they do not have any psychometric properties, and that's probably one of the most prevalent limitations of questionnaires. At most, questionnaires have got some form of face validity because you gave it to a statistician to review, and that person said, yeah, this is a questionnaire and it may work. And sometimes you have developed your questions in collaboration with maybe your study leader or with other people in like a focus group. So there is not, it's not to say that questionnaires are totally useless for studies, but you must understand the limitations of a questionnaire, namely that you can basically only do exploratory and descriptive studies with a self-designed questionnaire. So I now would like to show you an example of a self-designed questionnaire. So this is the family resilience study. It's a study that we are looking at doing, and it has a number of generic or biographical questions such as age, family size, employment situations, and then a number of self-designed questions that come from the researchers, not imagination, but you have thought them up yourself based on your knowledge of the context of the study, based on your knowledge of the literature that you have already explored. So you build these are self-designed questions. Now they look neat and they can actually work, these questions. But as they stand here, I have not taken any steps to improve their content validity. So content validity means other people can review these questions and indicate to you whether they think these are good questions, whether they think it will work or not to answer them. So yeah, but it still remains self-developed, self-designed, so you have thought them up. Now, the next part of this questionnaire consists of scales. And I'll now quickly go to that part. So all these are self-designed questions. And as I say, if the whole questionnaire was just these self-designed questions, then I could only pitch my study at an exploratory or a descriptive level. for the simple reason that I can analyze statistically the results, in my survey for each question individually. So I could say 20 people answered 3. 20, maybe 35 people said this is a risk factor, or maybe 35 people or 40 people said this is a protective factor. So I can do it, I can do the analysis only, statistically I can only do item by item analysis. All right. And that is typically what you can do with a self-designed questionnaire. Why? Because of the properties of a scale. And I will explain to you now what makes scales different. The next part of this survey consists of the adult resilience measure. It's a standardized scale. All right, so that I will now explain to you in the next part of the video. The question is, what is a measurement scale? So a measurement scale is defined as a collection of questions or items that have been pre-developed, tested and found to be valid and reliable representations of certain theoretical domains of study. So in simple terms, it's a number of items. They've been pre-developed by someone else. They've been tested empirically. We call it validated, in a validation study. And they have been found to be valid and reliable. And therefore, the collection of those questions represent a scale. So they measure certain domains in the study, and therefore and these are standardized. So a scale can be uni or multidimensional in nature. Scales have got a track record of testing that includes the establishment of statistical reliability or validity. The psychometric properties of a measurement scale gives it more value in research studies if they are used in these studies. So someone may test the scale in a study, and you can use the results from that study and the properties of that scale in your study. So this is called standardization and gives it a greater value. Scales have got a scoring mechanism that enables the researcher to estimate high and low scores, big or large problem, big or small problems, so you can use it to really measure the extent of a problem. Scales are also based on a specific construct, and that construct is derived from theory. So each question or item has been carefully designed and tested empirically. So I'm going to give you an example of a scale. Okay, so this is a typical scale, and you are all probably familiar with it. It's called a ruler. All right? So the ruler consists of centimeters on this side and inches on that side. So the different lines on this scale indicate 1 millimeter, 1 millimeter, and it carries on until you have 10 centimeters. The reason why this is a standardized scale is that you can buy a scale like this in any shop and use it for measurement purposes. So we say this is standardized. And the inches are the same as the millimeters. So this is a standardized instrument. And the same situation counts for scales in social research or as in this case, in business research. Okay, so using the analogy of the ruler that we discussed in the previous part of this video, let's now look at what are the benefits then of using measurement scales in research. So firstly, it adds more value to research because scales have got psychometric properties. Just like the ruler has specific lines here that indicate millimeters or centimeters and are universally accepted, we find that measurement scales in research are a lot more useful because of their psychometric properties. And I will explain what these psychometric properties are. Scales are also recognized as more scientific instruments, and therefore they are better to use than self-designed questions. The reason why they are more scientific is because they enable you to score, to develop a score on the scale, and those scores can be used for statistical comparison purposes. And the moment you start comparing groups, for instance, in research, like older people versus younger people, employed versus unemployed, knowledgeable versus less knowledgeable, the moment you start comparing, you have got a more powerful study that gives more knife-edge results. You can think for yourself, if you are using a ruler to measure, you are far more accurate in your observations of distance than when you would just guess. All right, and self-developed scales would be guesswork to a large extent. So using a scale removes that complexity of having to design your own measurement instrument that has no properties. All right, because you can design a ruler like this by saying, okay, more or less this is a millimeter, that's a centimeter, and so on, but without using a standard or existing existing measurements or using existing units. You are actually lost and you are just trying to do your own thing. It is true that you can design and develop your own measurement instrument in your study. If you so desire, of course you can do it. There's no secrets to designing and developing your own scales. But that is kind of a specialized research task. And you need to be very well experienced as a researcher to do it. And then specifically for something like a master's mini dissertation, it's just adding a lot to the burden of research that you have to complete. It's more likely that a person doing a PhD would consider designing your own measurement scale. And of course, you will only design your own measurement scale if you have scrutinized the field and come to the conclusion that there is no instrument that measures what you want to measure in your study, and that warrants or justifies the effort to design your own scale. So the easiest way and the best way, the method that is used most often by researchers, is to use what is available, to use scales that have been developed already and that can be transferred to your study. Like I've said, using a standardized scale gives you the ability to do more advanced statistical analysis. You can think for yourself that if you use your own tool that you have devised, you can only do frequencies and descriptive statistics, all right? But, and that is at item level. But with scales, you can do whole scale, you can use the whole scale, the score on the whole scale, or on the different dimensions. And you can do far more advanced statistical analysis by using standardized scales. This implies that you can use more rigorous research designs, such as correlational studies or structural equation modeling or regression analysis, which are far more advanced and specific kind of research designs. So using a scale gives more power to your research, and it adds value. And there's one thing that I didn't mention here, but if you use a scale that someone else has developed, you are more likely to publish your article in an international journal. So for most of you, that's maybe not so important, but if you are going into academia one day or into a more scientific kind of job, showing proof of publication becomes important as you proceed, and it's therefore a lot better if you can publish internationally. Your article is at least comparable. If you use your own scale, nobody knows about this tool in any way, so why would they publish your work? But using an existing scale is easily recognizable, and that is an advantage. Okay, so going back to the questionnaire that I showed you, you now should know that this is a questionnaire. It's a questionnaire because we use it for data collection purposes. The first part of the questionnaire consisted of self-designed questions. So in many instances, you can't get away totally by not putting in your own questions. There are very good reasons for putting in your own questions as well. But usually those questions, like in this instance, these questions that I've got here, they are there for a purpose. And the purpose of these questions is that they are part of my set of independent variables. Now, that is some other concept that you need to be familiar with in quantitative research, namely that your questionnaire should consist of one, biographical data, we've got that, and then independent variables. So variables that are used to check out their influence on or their relationship on the dependent variables. So a scale is used to measure the dependent variable. In other words, the perceptions of your participants regarding their own resilience or the perceptions about technology use. All right, those are dependent. But questions like this can be used as independent variables. So we can group all the responses. We can group it into two. Those that clearly said risk factor and those that clearly said protective factor. We could group it into two. Or everybody who has got a 1, 2, or a 3, they go into group 1. A 4 and a 5 go into group 2. So we can always group these, and therefore these are like independent variables. Right, so now we come to the scale part. So scales are used to measure the dependent variable. The dependent meaning the perceptual, the subjective response from people. So in this instance, we use the adult resilience measure revised. And you can see this scale measures your resilience. It's a standardized scale. There is properties for it, and therefore we decided to include it into this particular study because we are interested in measuring the resilience of adults. All right, that's now relevant for this in this example. So one implication of using a standardized scale is that you must use the items of the scale exactly as they've been designed in the study, that originates where the scale originated from. So these questions and the scaling format are all from a manual that accompanies the scale. Now, this particular example is more a kind of a clinical scale. In clinical psychology or in the social sciences, you would use this measure to almost diagnose, all right? But not all standardized scales are like that. It's just in this example. But using a scale means you cannot change some of the formulations in these items. If you were to change them, it's going to change the properties of the instrument. It's like saying, well, we've got the ruler now, okay, but we're going to change the size of a millimeter in here. Obviously, it's not going to measure reliably. It won't be accurate. So the same with these scales. You don't change the items, you use them as is. Okay, so here we have a number of items in the scale, and you use all the items, you don't leave them out. Okay, and the scaling format is the same and so forth. So you enter the scale items. All right. Okay, so until the end here. Now we've used, in this particular study, we've used a second scale. Now each scale that you add adds to the value of your study, because now you bring in a further dimension and you can compare the well-being scale with the resilience scale. All right. So the more scales you have, but of course, it has limits. Don't go overboard and put in 10 scales. That will be too much. Okay, once again, we put in all the items as is. Okay, and that means you have got your scale inserted in your questionnaire. Right. These few questions are a little bit different, but they're also part of the scale. There are specific instructions as to how you incorporate the scores of this with the scores of the other items that look slightly different, like this. Okay, and all those instructions you need to get about the scale. Otherwise, you are doing a bit of guesswork. Okay, so now you know a lot about scales already. You know that they are composed of different items. All right, now the question is, how do you select a suitable scale? Now, scales are often published in journal articles. So when you do a literature search in the library, you can specifically search for specific scales. Now, one way to get hold of a scale is when you start reading for your study in general. Let's say your study is about the precision of or prescription errors in hospitals. All right. So now you go and read about prescription errors in hospitals, in the pharmacy environment. And you find that there were some articles that used a particular scale. Let's say it's called the prescription error measurement scale. All right. So now you find evidence in those articles about the scale. And now you can go and search specific journal articles that utilize that scale. And in that way you collect evidence about the scales that were used in other studies, and you can, on the basis of that, decide to transfer it and use it in your scale. Therefore, it's important to identify scales that others have used in studies that are similar to yours. So, in your literature study, when you read an article, you are not only interested in the conclusions that those authors have come to. You are also interested in the methods that they used, because you can mimic those. You can not copy, but you can use those similar methods in your study. And also then the scales can be similar. Now, think for yourself. You have identified a scale that was used in another study. And there is a whole track record of studies that have used that instrument. Now you add a study from the South African context that uses the same scale, and all of a sudden your study is skyrocketed amongst all the other studies in the international context. Your study now makes so much more sense because you are competing with the other guys. You are bringing the same kind of evidence than the other guys, but just in a different context. Can you see how it improves the value of your study? Right, so you can conduct a search for scales by means of your own key concepts in your study. You can go and search for measurement scales on prescription errors, as an example. After the first find of a potential scale, trace its origins. So take it back to the first publication of the scale, and then look at subsequent validation studies. Let's say that the first version of your scale, the prescription error identification scale, was published in the 1980s. All right. Very good and nice. But if you find that that scale has been validated and revalidated and changed and improved over time, it becomes valuable to go to the latest version of the scale and use that. Now, sometimes scales end up being only accessible if you buy them. So you have to find out whether the scale is available in the public domain or not. And if it is not, you have to find out whether you can get permission from the authors to use the scale for research purposes. Many scales are actually sold, or if you use it, you pay. But sometimes authors of scales make available the scale to you free of charge if you use it for academic research purposes. So when you have got now your article with the validation data for the scale, so the validation data is the study where they proved that a centimeter on this instrument is exactly a centimeter according to the international standard. If you get that article, you have to report on the scale's reliability, validity, and there are different forms of validity that you can report on. I'll show you in an example. So it is better to get a scale with a substantial track record because, like I say, it immediately projects your study into a much more favorable and better position. So in your proposal, your research proposal, or your methodology chapter where you discuss the data collection instrument, that is where you insert the information about the scale and its properties. All right. Okay, now it's time to give you a practical example of a standardized scale and how it can be used in a study. So this scale is called the Technology Readiness Index, or TRI-2. So this scale was developed by these two gentlemen. They are from the US, and when I did my master's study, I wanted to use this instrument for my study. So I did quite a bit of research on the scale. And I actually contacted this guy, and I got permission from him to use the scale for purposes of my research. He made available the scoring mechanism, the scale items, everything he gave me permission to use. All right, so you are welcome to look at this example yourself, to get the article and look at it. you will see that this is fairly recent. It's quite a well-known scale, as I was then to discover. There are a number of articles that use this specific instrument. Okay, in the end, I did not use it for technical reasons, and time constraints. I used another one. But this is quite a neat little scale to use. So, Technology Readiness Index. So when you look at the article, the abstract gives you quite a bit of information. You know, it says it's a 36-item scale to measure people's propensity to embrace and use cutting-edge technologies. It was first published over a decade ago. It's been used in a variety of contexts and in over 24 countries, so that helps a lot. Meanwhile, several revolutionary technologies that were in their infancy just a decade ago are now pervasive and significantly impacting people's lives. Based on insights from extensive experience with the TRI and given the significant changes in the technology landscape, the authors undertook a two-phase research project to update and streamline the TRI, and that's where the TRI-2 came from. So now TRI-2 is now a 16-item scale, and in terms of content, structure, and psychometric properties, it compares very well with the original. So this article demonstrates the TRI's reliability, validity, and usefulness as a customer segmentation tool. Right, so then the article is about this whole validation. Now the first part of the article is about the background, a little bit about technologies and the new technologies that are available and how it will influence our lives, right? And so that's kind of the background. And from this first part of the discussion, you will be able to understand or get a sense of whether this could be a nice instrument to use. Conceptual underpinnings, so where does it come from in the literature? That's very necessary to show when you are demonstrating a scale like this. Okay, so this is all background, and this helps you to decide whether the scale would fit your kind of study. The structure of technology readiness and the TRI-1. So now we get to the scale structure. Right. And you can see the construct of the tool is the measurement scale is multifaceted, comprising 4 dimensions. All right, so 4 sections. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the structure. And then TRI-1, this is the 36 belief statements, and they use a 5.1 to 5 scale. Okay, so that's useful to know. And then they talk about their research program. You know, where did they get, how many people have used it. And here you can see 127 researchers in 30 countries. This is South Africa, 4%. Okay, so it's been used in South Africa in business type of studies. And then the reason for why they want to go and improve on the scale and revalidate it and so forth. So now they go to development of the TRI-2, and they start with a qualitative research phase. Usually when you develop scales, that's what you do. You have a qualitative research phase. You get the input from other people into your tool, in your measurement scale, and they help you formulate the scale. You get ideas from them. Right, so going down, not going to look at that too much. You know, these are comments by respondents in the qualitative research phase, you know, what they think and so on, and some possible items and how they formulated these. Right, and then they build like a new scale or an adjusted scale. They look at their existing scale and open up, put some more items in. So here you have 45 items, you enlarge the pool of items. And then they go into the quantitative research phase. That's where you now send it out to your participants. And they did like a national technology readiness survey. Right, and then they go and analyze this. They do a factor analysis, and from the factor analysis, they get to this, which is the technical detail. So in order for you to understand the validation process, so what they do is they administer the scale to a large sample of people. In this case, they had 354 people. And the online survey had 524. So they had quite a big data set. And then they use factor analysis, you see. You always start with the factor structure when you do a validation of a scale. So you look at the factor structure by means of factor analysis, in this case principal components analysis with Verimax rotation. So that helps you to get a sense of the underlying relationships amongst the different items. Right, and they came to the conclusion, the certain conclusions, and then after that, after they've completed that factor analysis, then they look at the reliability estimates between 0.68 to 0.9, and they did a second factor analysis on the 36 statements of the TRI. So they can do that because you just take out what you want and what you don't want, and then the reliability coefficients of that. Okay, so they go on preliminary 45 item scale. So you have to read this to appreciate what they all did. So it seems like they went through a whole reduction process. So reduction means, based on their statistics, they reduced the length of the scale to kind of get the right number of items and throw out items that did not work and so forth. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much technical detail. Right, so the article now goes into construct validity, and usually that is also a figure between 0 and 1. You can see factor loading, so it's still related to the whole factor analysis. Right, so this is validity. So you have to report on the validity of the scale in your methods. So make sure you get that information about, how these different items fit together into a construct. Right, so I'm just going to scroll forward because the part, so this is really the information. It's a bit technical, I agree. But it just adds so much more to your work if you can report on this as accurately as possible. Okay, and this is the end of this article. So this shows you then what kind of information you need to report on in your methods section of your proposal, as well as in chapter 3 of your dissertation. I end off this presentation by introducing this checklist. These are things you need to check when you have identified your scale. Make sure that you have your scale properties discussed under the data collection tool in the methodology part. Give background of the scale, the definition of its constructs, administration methods, scoring, and why this instrument will fulfill or will measure what you want to measure in your study. just a point on that. Sometimes you think that your work is so unique and there isn't a measure for that. If you are on that point, in other words, that there is no touch points between your conceptualization and your idea and what already exists in the universe of articles about that topic, then the problem does not lie with the fact that you do not have a measure. Then the problem lies with the fact that your study is incorrectly conceptualized. The world is no longer such a unique place that it's highly likely that what you have observed and want to survey is so unique that there is no literature that supports it. Okay? The fact of the matter is you are part of a whole body of literature, a whole body of scientists on these kinds of, on the kind of topic that you are working in. And it's better that you make sure that the way you have formulated your concepts of research and your research problem fits into the existing body of literature. Then the chances of failure are less. Sometimes you think your work is so unique there isn't any work out there or any literature that identifies it. But it is probably then a case of your terms that you have used are incorrect. In other words, it happens a lot in Afrikaans that your terms are so unique, your words are so unique that it feels like there's no connection with the existing body of literature. So then rather change your terms to fit what is already there than thinking you are a sole star in the universe with something completely unique. So provide information on these aspects, as I've said. Make sure that you report on whether the scale can be used as is in contexts that are different to the context that it has been developed for originally. Like in the case of the TRI-2, there is evidence that it has been validated in South Africa, probably. So make sure you can find the South African studies that have used it and check out whether it has been validated for local conditions or not. That will further enhance it. In what languages is it available? Like we said, TRI-2 was already used in the SA context. Okay, students, so with that, I hope this clarifies the whole matter of what is a measurement scale, how it is different from a questionnaire, a mere questionnaire, and why I hammer the point that it's better to use an existing scale or measurement instrument than starting all from scratch and trying to build your own. I'm sure those of you who cook will also know that good cooking starts with a good recipe. It's only later on when you are an expert chef that you can kind of mix and match and do something that is unique. In the final analysis, we all have to start with something that is already available. And that rule counts just as much in research. It's better to start off with something that is well known, that's well tested, that is a recipe. It will help you to not to fail, but to make a big success of your research. Okay, good luck and let me know if there's any uncertainty about this.